Hello, Facebook. So we're doing another live deleted scenes episode where I'm going to give you a little bit more of the background for the sermon from yesterday and just go a little bit more in depth with the story of Israel and the story of the Jews at the time that Jesus is born. Because the period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is incredibly interesting. And there's so much that happens there, and it has such a big effect on the New Testament and what we find going on there. And so it's really important. It can be really helpful to understand that time period. I personally think it's fascinating as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the Hasmoneans, which is a group you may not have heard of. You may have heard of the Maccabees. You also may have heard of Hanukkuh, and you may have heard of Herod. All of those are connected to this group of people called the Hasmoneans, who ruled over Judah in between the Old and New Testament for a little over 100 years. And there's a family tree that we're going to go over, and I hope this doesn't scare you off because it's a really fascinating story, and you don't need to memorize any of the names. But understanding some of the chaos that was going on at the time can really help to see the circumstances that Jesus is stepping into. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this group of people called the Hasmoneans. At the end of the Old Testament, the Jews are being ruled over by the Persians. The Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. They allow the Jews to come back and build a new temple, but they're still part of the Persian Empire. They're not independent. Not long after the end of the Old Testament, a fellow named Alexander the Great, whom you may have heard of, conquers the Persian Empire. Alexander is Greek, and so his new empire is Greek, and Judah becomes part of this Greek empire. But Alexander's empire fractures, and so what you end up with is several different Greek empires. And the one that rules over Judea eventually is the Syrian Greek Empire. It's ruled over by a family called the Seleucids. And the Seleucids are pretty harsh on the Jews, but it's not really until a guy named Antiochus IV Epiphanes takes over that things really go badly. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes, it's a heck of a name. He doesn't understand the politics of Jerusalem because Jerusalem is now split between liberal Jews who want to cooperate with the Greeks and conservative Jews who want nothing to do with anybody non-Jewish. And they're fighting each other. And Antiochus doesn't understand what's going on, so he thinks there's a rebellion going on. And he sends troops into Jerusalem, he takes over the city, and he takes over the temple as punishment for this rebellion, and he dedicates it to Zeus, and they sacrifice a pig on the altar, which is a huge deal. And they outlaw the Torah. They make it illegal to follow the law of Moses, which obviously does not go over well with the conservatives, with the Pharisees. And so this causes a lot of problems, and they send out messengers into the Persians send out the Greeks send out messengers around the area of Judea to start enforcing this rule that you can't follow the law anymore, you can't circumcise, you have to work on the Sabbath, all these different things. A messenger goes into a town and makes this proclamation, and he starts compelling Jews to make sacrifices to Zeus. There's a guy there, his name is Mattathias. And he is not okay with this. And so he actually goes up and stabs the messenger, kills him in front of everybody, and rallies the Jews to run into the hills and start a guerrilla war. Thing is, Mattathias is old, and so he dies very early in the rebellion. And so his son Judas takes over. And Judas has a nickname. His nickname is the Hammer. And in Greek, that's Maccabee. This is why they're called the Maccabees. And there's a book in the Catholic Bible called the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that tells this story. So Judas takes over, and he starts fighting a guerrilla war against the Greeks. And it goes back and forth. He actually wins a lot of battles because the Greeks just aren't ready for his fighting strategy. And finally, he drives them out of Jerusalem. And he enters Jerusalem, and they dedicate the temple. And that's the holiday that is called Hanukkah. when Jews celebrate Hanukkah, they're recognizing this event where Judas was able to liberate the temple from the Greeks. Judas does really well, but when he dies, they still aren't independent, and so his brother Jonathan takes over. Jonathan's nickname was the Diplomat, and he does really well. He wins even more ground as he's leading them, but eventually he's betrayed and killed, and so finally Simeon takes over. Simeon, the wise, and it's under Simeon that they are actually able to negotiate peace with the Greeks that leaves the Jews independent. So they have their own kingdom. And so Simeon is the first leader of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, the way he does that is he becomes the high priest, because under the Greek Empire, the most power they can have is high priest. They can't have a king. So Simeon becomes the high priest. But he can't call himself king for a very important reason. The Hasmoneans were a priestly family, and the priests came from the tribe of Levi. And the prophecies about the Messiah said that he would come from the tribe of Judah because he has to be a descendant of David. And so he can't call himself the Messiah. He's from the wrong tribe. Now Simeon dies, and his son, John Hyrcanus, takes over. He becomes high priest. But there's some conflicts that go on when he's king that separate him from the conservatives, the Pharisees that supported the first generations of the Maccabees, the first generations of the Hasmoneans. So he actually switches sides to the more liberal side. They're called the Hellenists, who want to cooperate with the Greeks. John Hyrcanus dies, and his son, Judah Aristobulus, becomes king. Now, Judah has none of the scruples of his father and grandfather, so he just calls himself king, which really ticks off the Pharisees and really creates a split where now this family is enemies with the conservatives who supported them in the Civil War. And so creates a huge issue. But the interesting thing is Judah has a wife, and his wife's name is Salome. Salome, you may recognize that name from the New Testament. I hope you can actually read it. That's not the best penmanship I've ever done. So she marries Judah Aristobulus, and she is from a family of Pharisees. So she helps protect the Pharisees when Judah is king. Judah dies before they have any kids. And so what that means is that Judah's brother, Alexander Jannaeus, becomes king. But according to Jewish law, he has to marry his brother's widow so that his brother can have an heir. So Salome becomes queen again. Now, Alexander Jannaeus really goes off the rails. He really hates the Pharisees, to the point that the Pharisees try and convince the Greeks to come in and take over Jerusalem again, because they figure it's better to be ruled by pagans than this terrible Jewish king. Ultimately, they change their minds and they help Alexander fight off the Greeks, but he's so angry that he takes 600 of them and crucifies them, and takes their families and murders them in front of them while they're on the crosses. This is the Jewish king who is doing this to his own people. This is a brutal time, just absolutely brutal. So Alexander Jannaeus dies, and his son, John Hyrcanus II, becomes king. But this is where things really get complicated, because when John Hyrcanus becomes king, his brother Aristobulus II decides that he wants to be king. And so he starts a civil war between the two of them. And so these two start fighting over who's king of Judea. And John Hyrcanus has this guy called Antipater from one of the other nearby provinces talking in his ear, telling him to keep fighting even though it looks like he's losing. Eventually, John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, they decide to ask the new power in town, Rome, to settle their dispute. And so the Roman general comes in, and he decides which one is going to be king. But the people don't like the decision, and so they rebel, and that causes Rome to just take over. They say, fine, you don't want our decision, we'll just conquer you instead. And so they conquer Jerusalem. It's brutal, it's violent, and they're no longer an independent country. But they still have this royal line of people who claim to be kings of the Jews. And eventually, Aristobulus II, he has a son named Antigonus Mattathias, who leads a rebellion against the Romans. And he massacres the Roman leaders in the area, and the Romans choose someone else to be the new king of the Jews. The Roman Senate appoints a man named Herod. Herod is from one of the neighboring provinces. He's the son of Antipater. And so Herod fights a war with Antigonus Mattathias. But Herod knows that he needs to legitimize his rule with the Jews. So he marries Aristobulus' granddaughter, Mariamne. So now Herod is one of the Hasmoneans. Herod defeats Antigonus and becomes king of the Jews, and that's how we find him in the New Testament. Eventually, however, he becomes suspicious of Mariamne because she has more royal blood than he does. He doesn't have any. And so he murders her, which kind of shows you what to expect when the Magi show up in front of Herod and say, hey, we found the king of the Jews. You're not surprised that he then tries to kill Jesus because he already did it to Mariamne. And so this whole royal family, this whole mess that went on, it's all in the background. And what you find when you understand this as you're reading the narratives of the Christmas story is that there's actually a battle going on between two royal families. On the one hand, you've got the royal family of David that God has appointed to be his royal family, they are supposed to be the ones that rule over God's people. But the Jews got tired of waiting, and so they appointed this other family to be king. And ultimately that results in King Herod. And King Herod likes to think of himself as the king of the Jews. And so he's trying to wipe out anybody who would claim to be part of this other royal family. Now, something that I mentioned in the sermon that I think is very fascinating is when you look at this family tree, you start to notice something that really stands out and helps you understand what's going on in the New Testament. You'll notice the names that are very common, the names that are in here. So they sound familiar. And when historians study the names in the New Testament and in that time period, they find that there are a lot of people who named their kids after people in this family. So, for instance, among the disciples, there are two Mattathiases. There's Matthew, the disciple who goes through the Gospels and wrote one of them. And then there's Matthias, who replaces Judas in Acts. You've also got several Judases, Jude, Judas, Judah, it's all the same name. You've got at least 4 Simons or Simeons that follow Jesus. And there's a Salome. There's 2 Johns. There's John the Baptist and the Apostle John. And Mariamne is another way of spelling Mary, which is by far the most popular female name in the New Testament. So what that tells us when we see people choosing to name their children after these figures, it shows that they are thinking and talking and praying about deliverance from these evil empires, from the Romans, because they're hoping for new Maccabees, for new liberators to take over. And so just in the names that you encounter as you're reading through the Gospels, you can see that these people are desperate for deliverance. They're desperate for someone to conquer the Romans and sort everything out for them and bring the reign of God back to them. And it also helps us to understand why there's such this expectation of the Messiah to come. Daniel had prophesied that it would be about 500 years until the Messiah came. And so they're in this time period of Jesus' life, they're looking at the calendar saying, hey, that's right about now. God should be doing something. The Messiah should be showing up. And so around this time of Jesus, from about 10 years before his birth to about 130 years after his birth, we know of at least 9 other Messiahs that Rome executed, that Rome killed, because so many people were coming forward trying to lead the Jews into rebellion against these empires. They were desperate for someone to save them. I said this in the sermon, but I think it's really important for us to understand that the message that Jesus was bringing, he brought to a people who were being deeply oppressed by the Roman Empire. And sometimes we turn the gospel into an answer simply for our first world problems. You know, how do I deal with my temper? How do I deal with my lust? How do I deal with the problems in my family? And God is here to answer those problems. But we also have to understand that God is here. God sends his son to deal with the big problems, with the serious problems, to confront evil, to confront oppression, to help the poor, help the hungry, help the widows and orphans. That is part and parcel, an essential element of the gospel. And as Christians, we need to be dedicated to that. I hope this jumble is helpful. Like I said, you don't need to be able to remember all the names, but mainly remember the jumble, that there's just this mess of human attempts to bring God's kingdom in all the wrong ways. And it results in this other royal family that just disintegrates throughout history and is ultimately taken over by the Romans. I hope this is helpful. Next week, we're going to be talking about the return of Yahweh. And so we'll have another video to follow up on that sermon and talk about the deleted scenes that don't make it into the Sunday service. Hope to see you then on Sunday morning at church and Monday afternoon in this video. God bless.